I mean, honestly, when Brenda marched up to the door clutching that stupid laminated pink violation slip, I literally couldn't believe she was trying to pick a fight over literal antique dirt. It's like, this is exactly why sovereign justice exists, because people will genuinely try to micromanage the chemical composition of your walls. Let's just dive into it.
Boca Raton, Florida, is a place where the grass isn't just greener on the other side. It's genetically modified, chemically sustained, and legally mandated to be exactly 2¼ inches tall. If you let it grow to 2½ inches, a woman with an angled bob and a golf cart will materialize out of thin air to hand you a fine. I knew this when I bought the house. I knew I was moving into the belly of the beast. But the property had good bones, and more importantly, it was situated at the end of a cul-de-sac with a massive wraparound lot that I got for an absolute steal because the previous owner had mysteriously fled the state. I later found out he fled because of the HOA, but that's a different story. I'm a guy who appreciates history. I like things with a little grit, a little character, so, heck, when I bought this cookie-cutter, stucco-slathered monstrosity, the first thing I did was hire a crew to rip off the cheap facade on the front elevation. Underneath it, by some absolute miracle of 1980s construction, was a layer of structural masonry. I spent a small fortune having genuine, reclaimed 100-year-old Chicago brick shipped down to Florida to face the front of the house. If you don't know anything about reclaimed Chicago brick, let me educate you. It is beautiful. It is imperfect. It has this incredible, natural, whitewashed salmon pink and ashy charcoal patina that you literally cannot replicate in a factory. It looks like it has survived a century of harsh winters, industrial smoke, and the passage of time, mostly because it actually has. It's porous, it's delicate, and it requires a very specific type of lime-based mortar that allows the wall to breathe. It is a work of art. Brenda did not think it was a work of art. Brenda was the president of the Shady Pines Homeowners Association. She possessed the kind of aggressive, relentless energy usually reserved for military dictators and people who yell at teenage retail workers over expired coupons. She drove a souped-up easy-go golf cart with a custom sun canopy and a literal siren mounted on the front. I am not making that up. She had a siren. It was a Tuesday morning. I was standing in my driveway, sipping a cup of black coffee, admiring the way the early Florida sun hit the varied textures of my beautiful brick wall. The air was already thick with humidity, that heavy, wet heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin by 8 a.m. And that's when I heard the electric whine of the E-Z-Go. She rounded the corner of the cul-de-sac, taking the turn so fast 2 of the wheels briefly left the pavement. She slammed on the brakes right at the edge of my property line, the tires screeching against the pristine asphalt. She didn't even turn off the cart. She just stepped out, holding a clipboard against her chest like a riot shield. She was wearing an oversized, aggressively yellow sun visor that cast a shadow over the top half of her face, leaving only her mouth visible. And her mouth was currently twisted into a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Morning, Brenda," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. I kept my voice perfectly level. "Never let them see you sweat." She didn't return the greeting. She just marched up my driveway, the rubber soles of her pristine white tennis shoes squeaking against the concrete. She stopped about 3 feet from me, planted her hands on her hips, and stared past me at the house. "It's spreading," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Good morning to you too," I replied. "What exactly is spreading? Joy? Sunshine?" "The mold," she snapped, jabbing a manicured finger toward my house. "The filth, the organic degradation, it is absolutely unacceptable." I turned and looked at my house. Brenda, we've talked about this. That's not mold. That is the natural patina of antique reclaimed brick. It's supposed to look like that. It's soot and lime and 100 years of character. I don't care if it's the Shroud of Turin, she barked, stepping closer. It looks like a crack den. It looks like a dilapidated warehouse. This is Shady Pines, not some inner-city slum. We have standards. We have property values to maintain. My property value went up 40% when I installed that brick, Brenda. I have received 6 complaints this week alone, she lied. I knew she lied because nobody else in the cul-de-sac cared. My neighbor to the left, a retired dentist named Gary, had explicitly told me he loved the brick because it broke up the monotony of the beige stucco nightmare that was our street. I find that hard to believe, I said, leaning against my car. You need to power wash it, she demanded. Today. I want to see a commercial-grade pressure washer out here blasting that disgusting grime off those walls by sundown, or I am issuing a formal citation. I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. Brenda, listen to me very carefully. You cannot power wash reclaimed Chicago brick. The clay is too soft. The firing process they used a century ago makes it incredibly susceptible to water damage at high velocity. If you hit that wall with 3,000 psi of water, you won't just wash off the patina. You will blast the face right off the brick. It will disintegrate. The lime mortar will crumble, the joints will fail, and water will infiltrate the structural envelope of my house. I will have a catastrophic moisture problem in a matter of days. She stared at me, blinking slowly behind the yellow plastic of her visor. I could tell that absolutely none of the words I had just said penetrated her skull. She didn't care about lime mortar. She didn't care about structural envelopes. She only cared about her pristine, sterile vision of suburbia. Are you refusing to comply with a direct verbal warning from the HOA president? She asked, her voice dropping an octave into a tone she probably thought was intimidating. I am refusing to destroy my own home, yes. She ripped a piece of paper off her clipboard. It was pink. It was laminated. It was a formal notice of violation. She thrust it toward me. I didn't take it. I just let it hover in the air between us. Fine, she spat. She dropped the laminated slip right onto the hood of my car. You have 30 days. 30 days to eliminate all visual blemishes and organic degradation from the front elevation of your property. If it is not clean, uniform, and compliant by the 1st of next month, you will be fined $100 a day, every single day, until we put a lien on your house and take it from you. She turned on her heel, marched back to her golf cart, and peeled out of my driveway, leaving me standing there with my coffee and a laminated threat. I picked up the pink slip. It was incredibly vague. Visual blemishes. Organic degradation. It was the kind of deliberately broad language that petty tyrants use so they can enforce rules selectively. I went inside, threw the slip on my kitchen counter, and pulled out my phone. I needed a second opinion. I needed a professional to confirm that I wasn't crazy. I scrolled through my contacts and called Sal. Sal was the master mason who had overseen the installation of the brick. He was a third-generation bricklayer from New York who had relocated to Florida to escape the winters. He had hands like catcher's mitts and a voice like a cement mixer. Hey, Sal, it's me. Hey, kid, what's shaking? The wall holding up? The wall is perfect, Sal. It's beautiful. The HOA, however, is a different story. Sal groaned loudly into the phone. Don't tell me. Let me guess. They want you to paint it. Worse, the president of the board just rolled up and demanded I power wash it. Commercial grade. She says it looks dirty. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Sal finally spoke, he sounded genuinely horrified. You absolutely cannot let anyone near that wall with a pressure washer. I'm dead serious. Do not let them do it. I tried explaining the structural integrity issue to her, Sal. She didn't care. Listen to me, Sal said, his voice urgent. That Chicago common brick, the outer crust, is the only thing protecting the soft interior clay. The kiln firing process back then was inconsistent. And if you hit that face with high pressure, you're going to cause what we call spalling. The face of the brick will literally flake off in chunks. And the mortar? Forget about it. We used a Type O lime putty mortar to match the historic specs. It's soft by design, so it can accommodate the expansion and contraction of the old brick. A pressure washer will carve that mortar out like a hot knife through butter. So what happens if she forces the issue and hires someone to do it while I'm at work? I asked, feeling a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. If they blast that wall, Sal said grimly, they'll strip the protective face. The brick will act like a sponge. In this Florida humidity, every time it rains, that brick will suck up water. It won't be able to dry out. The moisture will push through into your wall cavity. You'll have black mold behind your drywall in 3 months. The brick will start disintegrating into dust. You'll be looking at 50, maybe 60 grand in remediation and structural repairs. It'll destroy the house. I thanked Sal and hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the pink laminated slip on the counter. This wasn't just a petty squabble over lawn length or the color of my mailbox. Brenda was demanding I actively destroy my own property. If I complied, I would cause tens of thousands of dollars in structural damage. If I refused, she would fine me $100 a day, $3,000 a month, until they foreclosed on my home. I was backed into a corner. I was trapped. And I absolutely hate being trapped. That night I didn't sleep. I brewed an entire pot of espresso, carried it into my home office, and booted up my computer. I opened the digital file containing the Shady Pines Homeowners Association covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC&Rs. The unholy Bible of suburban oppression. It was 412 pages long. It was written by lawyers who were paid by the word, filled with dense, impenetrable legalese designed to confuse and intimidate homeowners into blind submission. But I am a very patient man, and I was very, very angry. I started at page 1. I read through the restrictions on commercial vehicles, none allowed. I read through the restrictions on holiday decorations, must be removed within 7 days of the holiday. I read through the mandates on roof tile colors, terracotta, desert sand, or Spanish clay only. Hours passed. The neighborhood outside my window was dead silent, as the only sound in the room was the hum of my computer tower and the clicking of my mouse. My eyes were burning, dry and gritty from staring at the bright screen in the dark room. Around 3:15 a.m., I hit page 284. Section 14, subsection C, exterior, maintenance of masonry and stucco surfaces. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart suddenly beating a little faster. I read the paragraph once. I read it twice. I highlighted it. I read it a third time, whispering the words out loud to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from the caffeine. All exterior walls must be maintained in a clean, uniform, and aesthetically pleasing manner. Said surfaces must be completely free of visual blemishes, organic growth, discoloration, or deterioration. And in the event that a masonry or stucco surface cannot be cleaned to the satisfaction of the Architectural Review Committee, the homeowner must remediate the surface by ensuring it is otherwise fully painted in a uniform, highly visible protective coating to seal the masonry against moisture intrusion. I stopped. I stared at the words. Fully painted in a uniform, highly visible protective coating to seal the masonry. Oh, Brenda, you foolish, foolish woman. The lawyers who wrote this document were trying to cover all their bases. They were trying to say, if your house is stained, you have to paint over the stain. They wanted everything to look neat and tidy, but they didn't specify a color palette for the masonry sealant. They had a strict 4-page list of approved colors for trim, doors, and roofs. But for an emergency protective coating on a masonry surface to remediate a violation, they just said it had to be uniform, and they said it had to be highly visible. They probably meant visible, as in opaque. They meant it couldn't be a clear coat if the brick was stained. They meant the paint itself had to be visibly present. But legally, the text is the text. The text is the law. And the text demanded a highly visible coating. If I couldn't power wash my house without destroying it, the bylaws gave me an out. I had to paint it. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. I loved my antique brick. I really did. It physically pained me to think about covering it up. But the thought of malicious compliance, the thought of taking their own tyrannical rules and weaponizing them against them, was intoxicating. If I had to paint my house to comply with Brenda's insane demands, I wasn't going to paint it desert sand. I wasn't going to paint it beige or gray or eggshell. I was going to make it the most highly visible house on the eastern seaboard. I opened a new tab on my browser. I started typing. I bypassed standard exterior paints. I bypassed neon. I went straight to the industrial sector. I started researching strontium aluminate. It's the chemical compound used in commercial-grade glow-in-the-dark applications. It absorbs UV light during the day and emits a staggering amount of luminescence at night. It is incredibly durable. It is a highly effective sealant, and it is aggressively, radioactively, blindingly green. I found a specialty chemical supplier in Nevada that sold strontium aluminate powder in bulk, designed to be mixed into a heavy-duty acrylic polymer clear coat. If applied correctly, the house would look like a slightly off-white, pale greenish yellow during the day. It would look ugly, sure, but at night? At night, my house would glow with the intensity of 1,000 dying suns. It was a brilliant plan. It was petty, it was technically compliant, and it would drive Brenda absolutely out of her mind. But there was a flaw. I knew how these HOA boards operated. If I just painted the house glow in the dark, Brenda would immediately call an emergency session, invent a new rule, pass an amendment banning luminescent paint, and force me to repaint it. They would bury me in litigation. So they had a war chest of neighborhood dues to pay their lawyers. I just had my savings account. I needed an ironclad defense. I needed something that superseded the HOA bylaws. I needed a trump card so powerful that even their high-priced community association lawyers wouldn't touch it. I needed federal law. I opened another tab. I started digging into property rights, First Amendment protections, and obscure federal statutes. I spent another 2 hours going down rabbit holes of case law. I read about people who had painted the American flag on their roofs, people who had registered their properties as religious sanctuaries to avoid zoning laws. None of it fit my situation perfectly. Then, around 5:30 a.m., just as the sky outside my window was starting to turn a bruised, pre-dawn purple, I found it. I stumbled across an article in an obscure legal journal about a real estate developer in New York who had tried to tear down an old warehouse. The warehouse was covered in graffiti. The developer had the permits, he owned the building, and he had the right to demolish it. But a group of artists had sued him and won an injunction, stopping the demolition of a building they didn't even own. How? Because of something called the Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1990. VARA. I sat up straight, my fatigue instantly evaporating. I pulled up the actual text of the statute from the Cornell Law Library. VARA is an amendment to the United States Copyright Act. It grants certain moral rights to the creators of recognized works of visual art. Specifically, it grants the artist the right to prevent any intentional distortion, mutilation, or other modification of that work, which would be prejudicial to his or her honor or reputation. And crucially, it prevents the destruction of a work of recognized stature. The law was originally designed to stop museums from chopping up a painting or cities from melting down a public sculpture. But the application of the law had evolved. If an artist creates a site-specific mural on a building, and if they have a contract stipulating that the mural is a recognized work of art, the owner of that building cannot destroy or alter the mural without the artist's explicit written consent, even if the owner of the building wants it gone. And more importantly, no third party can force the destruction of that art. If I just painted my house, it was exterior maintenance subject to the whims of the HOA. But if I commissioned a recognized artist to create a site-specific conceptual art installation on the front elevation of my property, that wasn't exterior maintenance. That was a federally protected work of visual art. If the HOA tried to force me to paint over it, they wouldn't just be fighting me. They would be fighting the artist's federal copyright protections. They would be violating a federal statute that carried massive statutory damages. I started laughing. It was a dry, raspy laugh in the quiet of my office. Brenda wanted a uniform, highly visible protective coating. I was going to give her one. I wasn't just going to paint my house, I was going to commission a masterpiece. I looked at the clock. It was 6 a.m. I had exactly 29 days left before my fine kicked in. I grabbed a notepad and a pen. I had to find a contractor. But I didn't need just any guy with a roller and a bucket. I needed someone specific. I needed an artist. I needed someone whose portfolio was weird enough to justify the project, but professional enough to hold up in court if the HOA tried to argue the art wasn't of recognized stature. I spent the next 2 days scouring Instagram, local gallery websites, and Facebook groups for artists in the South Florida area. I looked at muralists, street artists, conceptual sculptors. Most of them were too traditional. They painted beautiful flamingos on the sides of seafood restaurants or geometric patterns in corporate lobbies. I didn't need flamingos. I needed chaos. Finally, I found him. His name was Zephyr. I don't know if that was his legal name, and I didn't care. His Instagram was a chaotic mosaic of massive and aggressive industrial art installations. He had recently completed a project in Miami where he painted the entire interior of an abandoned warehouse with Vantablack and filled it with strobing neon tubes. He described his aesthetic as post-industrial apocalyptic surrealism. He was perfect. I sent him a direct message. Hey Zephyr, I have a massive residential canvas in Boca Raton. I need a site-specific installation. I want to use commercial-grade strontium aluminate to completely seal a brick facade. It's a statement piece about the radioactive decay of suburban conformity. Are you interested? He replied 3 minutes later. I'm listening. Let's meet. We agreed to meet at a dive bar on the edge of town the following afternoon. I brought a folder containing photographs of my house, the pink violation slip from Brenda, the HOA bylaws, and a drafted contract I had spent the morning writing. I walked into the bar and spotted him immediately. He was sitting in a booth in the back, nursing a cheap beer. He looked exactly like a guy who described his art as post-industrial apocalyptic surrealism. He was wearing paint-splattered overalls over a ripped band t-shirt, and he smelled faintly of turpentine, patchouli oil, and stale cigarettes. I slid into the booth across from him and dropped the folder on the sticky table. "I'm the guy with the brick house," I said. Zephyr took a slow sip of his beer and looked at me. "Tell me about the radioactive decay of suburbia, man." I spent the next 20 minutes laying out the entire situation. I told him about the reclaimed Chicago brick. I told him about Brenda, the golf cart, and the siren. And I explained the physics of spalling and lime mortar. I read him the exact text of the HOA's demand for a highly visible protective coating. Zephyr listened in complete silence. He didn't interrupt once. He just kept looking at the photos of my house, tracing the grout lines of the antique brick with his thumb. When I finished, I pushed the contract across the table. "I don't just want you to paint my house, Zephyr," I said, leaning forward. "I need you to officially commission this as an original work of visual art. I need you to sign this contract stating that this application of strontium aluminate is a site-specific mural titled Nuclear Dawn in Suburbia. I am going to pay your standard day rate, plus the cost of materials, and an extra $5,000 as a commissioning fee for the intellectual property rights." Zephyr picked up the contract. He read it over, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs where I had meticulously cited the Visual Artists' Rights Act. "Man," Zephyr said softly, "you want to turn your house into a giant glow stick to piss off your HOA?" "No," I corrected him smoothly. "I want to apply a highly visible protective coating to seal my masonry, exactly as demanded by the Architectural Review Committee. It just so happens that the coating I have chosen is a federally protected artistic statement." Zephyr looked up from the paper. A slow, chaotic grin spread across his face. "I love it," he said. "It's aggressive, it's petty, it's technically compliant. But let me ask you a question. Do you know how bright commercial-grade strontium aluminate actually is?" "I assume it's bright." "It's not just bright," Zephyr said, leaning over the table. "I worked with this stuff on a club installation in Berlin a few years ago. If we mix this at a 30% ratio into a heavy acrylic base and do 2 coats, during the day, your house is going to look like a slightly jaundiced piece of cheese. But at night, it absorbs ambient UV all day. When the sun goes down, it is going to emit a localized aura. It will cast shadows on your neighbors' lawns. You won't need a porch light. You won't need street lights. It is going to look like a radioactive core breach." "That," I said, "is exactly what I am paying for." "And when they try to paint over it?" Zephyr asked, tapping the VARA clause in the contract. "If anyone, Brenda, am an HOA contractor, a rogue neighbor, touches that wall with a roller or a pressure washer, they are permanently altering your artwork without your consent. Under VARA, you and I will file an immediate federal injunction, and we will sue the Shady Pines Homeowners Association for the maximum statutory damages of $150,000. Zephyr pulled a pen out of the pocket of his overalls. He didn't even hesitate. He signed his name with a dramatic flourish at the bottom of the page. "I'll need to order the powder from Nevada," he said, sliding the contract back to me. "It'll take a week to freight it down here. I can prep the surface with a clear binding primer on the 25th. We apply the luminous coats on the 26th. The 26th, 4 days before my deadline." "Perfect," I said. Munchine, I stood up and offered him my hand. "Welcome to Boca Raton, Zephyr." He shook my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "This is going to be a masterpiece, man. A genuine, glowing middle finger to the establishment." I left the bar feeling a profound sense of calm. The trap was set. The contract was signed. The wheels were in motion. Brenda thought she was playing chess, but she was about to realize she was playing checkers on a board covered in wet, radioactive cement. The next 3 weeks were agonizingly slow. Every time I drove through the neighborhood, I saw Brenda patrolling in her golf cart. Sometimes she would park at the end of my driveway and just stare at my house, clearly waiting for the power washers to arrive. Whenever I checked my mail, I caught her glaring at me from across the street. I just smiled and waved. So on the 24th, I received another letter from the HOA. It was a friendly reminder that my deadline was approaching, printed on the same aggressive pink paper. It reiterated the threat of the daily fine and included a helpful list of approved exterior cleaning vendors. I took the letter, folded it into a paper airplane, and threw it into the recycling bin. On the morning of the 25th, a beat-up white cargo van pulled into my driveway. The side of the van was covered in abstract spray paint. Zephyr stepped out, followed by 2 guys who looked like roadies for a heavy metal band. They started unloading ladders, drop cloths, and massive 5-gallon buckets of clear industrial acrylic primer. I walked out to meet them. "Morning, artists," I said. "We are ready to prep the canvas," Zephyr announced. They spent the entire day carefully rolling a clear, binding primer over my beautiful antique Chicago brick. It hurt my soul to watch the matte, powdery finish of the historic clay get sealed behind a slight, glossy sheen. I had to keep reminding myself that this was the only way to save the house from destruction. Brenda drove by 4 times that day. On the 4th pass, she finally stopped. She didn't get out of her cart, but she yelled across the lawn over the sound of the siren. "I see you're finally taking action," she called out, sounding incredibly smug. "A clear sealant is a good first step, but you still need to address the discoloration. It needs to be uniform." I walked over to the edge of the driveway. "Don't worry, Brenda," I said politely. "The primer has to cure for 24 hours. The uniform, this highly visible protective coating, goes on tomorrow." She smiled. It was a terrifying, triumphant expression. "Glad to see you cooperating. I'll be inspecting it tomorrow evening." "I look forward to it," I replied. The next morning, the van returned. This time they unloaded 3 heavy, reinforced steel buckets. Zephyr popped the lid off one of them and called me over. "Look at this," he said, his eyes wide. I peered into the bucket. It was filled with a thick, viscous liquid that looked exactly like the slime from an 80s sci-fi movie. It was a pale, sickly neon green. It looked dense. It looked unnatural. "We mixed it at a 40% ratio," Zephyr whispered reverently. "It's so heavy with strontium aluminate we have to use specialized commercial rollers to get it to adhere to the brick without sagging." "Do it," I said. They started painting. It was a meticulous process. They had to press the thick, glowing sludge deep into the lime mortar joints to ensure the protective coating was perfectly uniform, just as the bylaws demanded. By 2 p.m., the front elevation of my house was entirely coated. In the harsh, direct sunlight of a Florida afternoon, it looked absolutely terrible. It looked like someone had taken a massive highlighter and violently scribbled all over a perfectly good house. The beautiful varied patina of the antique brick was completely obscured by a solid, flat, aggressive wall of pale, sickly chartreuse. It was the ugliest house in Boca Raton. I was sitting on a lawn chair in my driveway, watching the paint dry, When Brenda arrived for her inspection, she didn't speed this time. She drove the golf cart at a slow, deliberate crawl. She parked in the street, turned off the engine, and stepped out. She didn't have her clipboard today. She just stood there, her mouth hanging slightly open, staring at the front of my house. I stood up and walked down the driveway to meet her. "Well?" I asked. "Is it uniform?" She blinked, her eyes darting across the unbroken expanse of neon green. What is that color?" she stammered. "It's a custom industrial blend," I said smoothly. I wanted to make sure I was in full compliance with Section 14, subsection C. It's a highly visible protective coating. It completely seals the masonry against moisture intrusion. "It's green!" she yelled, her voice suddenly finding its volume. "It's hideous. It looks like vomit." "The bylaws don't specify a color palette for emergency masonry remediation coatings, Brenda. I checked. Very thoroughly. They just require it to be uniform and highly visible. I think we can agree it is both of those things." Her face was turning a dangerous shade of purple. "You did this on purpose. You are mocking this association." "I am complying with your direct written order," I replied, my voice dropping its friendly pretense. "You demanded a coating. I applied a coating. My property is now completely free of visual blemishes and organic degradation. I consider this matter closed." "Closed?" she shrieked. "You think this is closed? I am calling an emergency board meeting tonight. We are going to draft an amendment banning this atrocity. You will be painting over this by Monday morning, or I will have contractors out here to do it for you, and I will bill you for the labor." She stormed back to her golf cart. Zara slammed her foot on the accelerator and sped off. I watched her go, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. "You're going to try to paint over it," I thought. Perfect. I turned back to look at my house. Zephyr and his crew were packing up the van. Zephyr walked over, wiping a smear of green slime off his forehead. "She seems upset," he noted dryly. "She hasn't seen anything yet," I said. "The sun is going down in 3 hours." Zephyr grinned. "I'm going to stick around for the show, if you don't mind. I need photographs of the installation for my portfolio anyway." "Grab a beer," I said, gesturing to a cooler I had brought out to the garage. "We have front row seats." We sat in the driveway as the afternoon dragged on. The thick, oppressive heat slowly began to lift as the sun dipped lower in the sky, and the shadows in the cul-de-sac stretched out, long and dark. I felt a genuine physical thrill of anxiety building in my chest. This was the point of no return. I had officially declared war on the most powerful entity in my neighborhood. There was no backing out now. The sun finally slipped below the horizon. The sky shifted from blue to orange to a deep, bruised violet. The streetlights at the corner of the cul-de-sac flickered to life, casting a dull orange sodium glare across the asphalt. And my house woke up. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, creeping phenomenon. As the ambient light in the neighborhood faded, the strontium aluminate began to release the massive payload of UV energy it had absorbed over the last 6 hours. At first, it was just a faint, ethereal haze hovering over the brick. But as the darkness deepened, the reaction intensified. By 8 p.m., the house was glowing. It wasn't a subtle glow. It wasn't like a novelty watch dial or a child's plastic star stuck to a bedroom ceiling. This was a commercial-grade, heavy acrylic saturation. The entire front elevation of the house was emitting a solid, unbroken wall of piercing, radioactive neon green light. It was so bright, it cast hard, distinct shadows on my front lawn. It illuminated the underside of the oak tree in my front yard, turning the leaves an eerie, supernatural color. The glow pushed out across the street, painting Gary the dentist's driveway with a sickly green pallor. It was magnificent. It was horrifying. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "My God," Zephyr whispered, lowering his beer. On us, even the avant-garde artist was stunned by the sheer magnitude of what we had created. It's a beacon. It's nuclear dawn in suburbia," I corrected him. Suddenly, a porch light snapped on across the street. A door opened. Gary stepped out onto his porch, wearing a plaid bathrobe and holding a newspaper. He looked up. He froze. He dropped the newspaper. He slowly reached up and took off his glasses, rubbing his eyes as if he couldn't trust his own vision. Further down the street, another door opened. A woman stepped out, shielding her eyes with her hand. Then another. And another. Within 10 minutes, half the cul-de-sac had spilled out onto their lawns. They were standing in the humid night air, bathing in the neon green radiation of my malicious compliance. Nobody was speaking. They were just staring in stunned, irreverent silence at the massive, glowing monolith at the end of their street. Then, the silence was broken. From 3 houses down, I heard a familiar, furious shriek. "What is that?" It was Brenda. She had emerged from her house. I could see her silhouette marching down the sidewalk, her arms flailing wildly. "What have you done?" she screamed, practically jogging toward my driveway. "Turn it off! Turn it off right now!" "I can't turn it off, Brenda," I yelled back pleasantly. "It's a chemical reaction. It absorbs photons." "It's illegal!" she shrieked, stopping at the edge of the green light perimeter, as if she were afraid stepping into it would mutate her DNA. "It's light pollution! It's a hazard! I am calling the police!" "Go right ahead," I offered, gesturing toward the street. "Tell them my masonry sealant is too effective!" She whipped out her phone, her fingers jabbing furiously at the screen. She paced back and forth on the sidewalk, glaring at me with a hatred so pure it could have powered the house on its own. "They're coming," she yelled at me a minute later. "You're going to jail. You're going to be arrested for public nuisance." I just took another sip of my beer. Zephyr was quietly taking photos with a professional DSLR camera, capturing the chaotic scene for his portfolio. We waited. The glowing house hummed with silent energy. The neighbors stayed on their lawns, murmuring in hushed, confused tones. At exactly 8:45 p.m., the quiet of the neighborhood was shattered by the sound of heavy engines. 2 Boca Raton police cruisers turned onto the street. They didn't have their sirens on, but their red and blue light bars were flashing, cutting through the neon green haze with a jarring strobing effect. The cruisers pulled up to the front of my house and stopped. I stood up, putting my beer down on the cooler. It was time for Phase 2. 2 Boca Raton police officers stepped out of the lead cruiser. They didn't even bother closing their doors. They just stood behind their open car doors, completely frozen, staring at my house. The strobe of their light bars was reflecting off the massive, glowing green surface, creating this violently chaotic disco effect across my entire front lawn. I mean, honestly, you could literally see the exact moment their brains tried to process what they were looking at, and just blue-screened. I walked slowly down to the edge of the street, keeping my hands perfectly visible and holding nothing but a half-empty can of cheap beer. I didn't want any misunderstandings. Zephyr stayed back by the garage, his camera clicking away like a machine gun in the quiet night. "Evening, officers," I called out, keeping my voice super casual, like I wasn't standing in front of a radioactive monolith. Can I help you guys with something? The older officer, a guy who looked like he was about 3 weeks away from a pension and 0% interested in this kind of nonsense, finally blinked. He reached up, took off his uniform cap, and scratched his thinning hair. "Sir," he started, his voice thick with a mix of exhaustion and genuine confusion. Is your house glowing?" "Yes, sir," I said, nodding solemnly. "It is highly visible." Before the officer could even formulate a follow-up question, Brenda came sprinting, literally sprinting, across the wet grass of my lawn. She was practically vibrating with rage. "Arrest him!" she screeched, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "Officer, I want him in handcuffs right now. He is building some kind of illegal nuclear reactor in a residential neighborhood. It's a biohazard. It is emitting radiation." The younger cop, a rookie who looked like he was about 12 years old, instinctively dropped his hand to his utility belt, his eyes darting nervously between my glowing brick wall and Brenda's wildly flailing arms. "Ma'am, please step back," the older officer said, putting a hand up to stop her forward momentum. He turned back to me, squinting against the sheer volume of light my house was throwing at him. "Sir, we received a 911 call about an unlicensed hazardous materials incident and severe light pollution. What exactly is going on here?" "I mean, honestly, officer, it's just paint," I said, taking a sip of my beer. "Paint?" the rookie echoed, sounding incredibly skeptical. "Paint doesn't do that. Paint doesn't cast shadows across the street." "It's a commercial-grade masonry sealant mixed with a high concentration of strontium aluminate," I explained calmly, leaning against my mailbox. "It's an inert, non-toxic, non-radioactive compound. It absorbs ambient ultraviolet light during the daytime and emits it as a luminescent glow at night. It's the exact same chemical they use to make the glow-in-the-dark stars you stick on a kid's ceiling, just, scaled up a bit." Brenda let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. "He's lying! Look at it! It's a public nuisance! It violates city ordinances on light pollution!" I shook my head slowly, looking at the older officer with an expression of polite exasperation. "Actually, I checked the Boca Raton Municipal Code on light pollution, Title 14, Chapter 3. The ordinance specifically restricts the lumen output and directional shielding of artificial light fixtures, halogen bulbs, LED floodlights, exposed incandescent filaments. It explicitly regulates fixtures connected to an electrical current. My house does not have any unshielded fixtures. It is not plugged into the grid. It is completely passive." The older cop stared at me. He looked at the house. He looked down at Brenda. He let out a ragged sigh that sounded like it came from the very bottom of his soul. "He's right, ma'am," the older officer said, his voice flat. "If there's no electrical source, it's not a light fixture. It's just a highly reflective surface. Technically, it's no different than painting your house white and having the moon shine on it." "The moon doesn't look like a toxic waste dump," Brenda screamed. "It is blinding. It is a hazard to navigation." "Ma'am, unless planes are trying to land on this cul-de-sac, it's not a hazard to navigation," the older cop replied, his patience clearly wearing paper thin. He turned to me. "Look, buddy, I don't know why you did this. I don't really want to know. It's a civil matter. It's an HOA issue. We don't enforce HOA bylaws. As long as you aren't storing actual uranium in there, and as long as you aren't pointing a spotlight into traffic, no city laws are being broken. I am simply complying with an official mandate from the Shady Pines Architectural Review Committee," I said, gesturing to Brenda. "They issued a formal citation demanding I apply a highly visible protective coating to seal my masonry. I'm just following orders, officer." The older cop looked at Brenda. The look he gave her was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. He had clearly dealt with her kind before. "You told him to do this?" he asked her. "I told him to clean his disgusting house," she sputtered, her face now matching the color of a ripe tomato. Not turn it into a glow stick? Well, maybe next time you should be more specific, the cop muttered. He turned back to the rookie. We're done here. Clear the call. Code 4. No crime committed. You can't just leave, Brenda shrieked, actually grabbing the older officer's sleeve. Do your job. This is a decent neighborhood. The officer slowly looked down at her hand on his sleeve until she snatched it back. Ma'am, if you call 911 again for a non-emergency civil dispute regarding your neighbor's paint choices, I will personally write you a citation for misuse of emergency services. Have a good night. They walked back to their cruisers. But before they got in, the older cop stopped, pulled out his personal smartphone, and snapped a quick picture of my house. He actually cracked a tiny smile before shaking his head and climbing into the driver's seat. The cruisers backed out, killed their lights, and rolled away into the night. It was just me, Zephyr, and Brenda left standing in the neon green radiation zone. Brenda was shaking. She was literally vibrating with a rage so intense I thought she might actually have a stroke right there on my driveway. She looked at me, her eyes wide and manic in the bizarre green lighting. This isn't over, she whispered, her voice trembling. I am the president of this association. I am the final word. I am calling an emergency executive session of the board tomorrow morning. We are going to pass an immediate injunction. We will hire a contractor to come out here and paint your house beige by force, and we will put a lien on your property for the cost. You are done here. She turned around and power-walked back to her house, slamming her front door so hard I heard the glass rattle from halfway down the block. I took a deep breath of the humid night air. I looked over at Zephyr, who was packing his camera back into its bag. Well, Zephyr said, grinning in the green darkness. I'd say that was a successful exhibition opening. It was perfect, I replied. But she's right about one thing. Tomorrow is going to be the real fight. She's going to try to mobilize the entire board against me. Are you ready for it? I patted the front pocket of my jeans, where I had a folded copy of the VARA statute and our signed contract. I literally can't wait. That night, I didn't even need to turn on a lamp in my living room. The glow from the front of the house bled through the window blinds, casting these crazy, eerie green stripes across my ceiling. It was like sleeping inside a laser tag arena. I woke up the next morning feeling incredibly refreshed, probably because I was fueled by pure, unadulterated spite. At exactly 9 a.m., a courier van pulled up to my mailbox. The driver walked up to my front door, looking highly disturbed by the pale, sickly yellow-green color the house possessed in the daylight, and handed me a thick manila envelope. It was an official summons from the law firm representing the Shady Pines Homeowners Association. I took it into my kitchen, brewed a pot of coffee, and tore it open. It was a masterpiece of aggressive legal intimidation. It was a formal notice of immediate mandatory remediation. It stated that my property was in gross violation of community aesthetic standards, constituted a public nuisance, and was actively damaging the property values of the surrounding homes. The best part? It demanded I attend an emergency, a mandatory hearing of the HOA board at 7 p.m. that evening at the community clubhouse. If I failed to appear, or if I failed to agree to their terms, they were legally authorizing themselves to hire a commercial painting crew to cover my house in a shade called Desert Sand at 8 a.m. the following morning, with all costs, legal fees, and administrative fines billed directly to my mortgage escrow. They thought they had me. They thought they could bully me with a letterhead from a fancy Boca Raton law firm. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I didn't just print out the VARA statute. I printed out 3 massive binding legal precedent cases where artists had successfully sued property owners under the Visual Artists' Rights Act. I printed out Zephyr's portfolio, highlighting his gallery exhibitions and commercial commissions to firmly establish his legal definition as an artist of recognized stature. I put everything into nice, neat, tabbed binders. I made 6 copies, 1 for each board member and 1 for their lawyer. At 6:45 p.m., I put on a sharp, tailored navy suit. If you're going to execute a legal slaughter, you should dress for the occasion. I grabbed my box of binders, walked out to my car, and drove the 4 blocks to the Shady Pines Community Clubhouse. The parking lot was completely packed. This wasn't just a board meeting. Brenda had rallied the troops. Word of the glowing radioactive house had spread through the subdivision like wildfire. People who had never attended an HOA meeting in their lives were cramming through the double doors of the clubhouse, desperate to see the execution of the neighborhood rogue. I walked into the main hall. The room was buzzing with low, angry whispers. There were at least 80 residents sitting in folding chairs. At the front of the room, seated behind a long folding table, was the HOA Board of Directors. 5 people who looked like they actively enjoyed making other people miserable. Right in the center, flanked by the association's slick-looking corporate attorney, sat Brenda. She looked up and saw me walk in. A smug, predatory smile spread across her face. She banged a wooden gavel on the table. "Order!" she barked into a microphone that was turned up entirely too loud, creating a screech of feedback that made the front row wince. I call this emergency executive session of the Shady Pines Homeowners Association to order. And the sole item on tonight's docket is the immediate remediation of the gross aesthetic violation located at the end of Oakwood Court. The room fell dead silent. 80 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. I walked down the center aisle, my face completely neutral, and took the single empty chair they had placed facing the board table. It felt like a tribunal. "Let the minutes reflect," Brenda continued, practically salivating into the microphone, "that the homeowner was issued a lawful order to clean his horribly degraded brick facade. In an act of petty, malicious defiance, he intentionally vandalized his own property with an industrial, glow-in-the-dark chemical that has disrupted the peace and lowered the property value of every single home in this association." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I saw a few people nodding angrily. "We are not here to debate," the HOA attorney chimed in, leaning forward. He was a guy in his late 30s wearing a suit that cost more than my car. "The CC&Rs clearly state that the board holds final discretionary power over all exterior modifications. You did not submit an architectural request form for neon green paint. Therefore, the modification is illegal, void, and subject to immediate removal." "We have drafted a binding agreement," Brenda said, holding up a piece of paper. "You will sign this right now. It grants our approved contractors the legal right to enter your property tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. to prime and paint your entire house in the approved color of desert sand. You will be billed for the labor, the materials, and an emergency non-compliance fine of $5,000. What if you refuse to sign? Our attorney will file an injunction in county court tomorrow. We will put a lien on your house, and we will force a foreclosure sale to recoup our damages." She slammed the paper down on the table. "Your childish little game is over. Sign it." I looked at the paper. I looked at Brenda. I looked at the slick attorney. I didn't reach for a pen. Instead, I reached down, picked up my heavy box of binders, and placed it on the table in front of me. "I mean, honestly, I started, making sure my voice was loud enough to carry to the back of the room without a microphone. I find this entire proceeding incredibly confusing. Brenda, 2 weeks ago, you handed me a violation notice demanding I eliminate visual blemishes by applying a, and I quote, highly visible protective coating to seal the masonry. That is the exact verbiage you used. Don't play semantics with me, Brenda snapped. You know exactly what I meant. I don't know what you meant, Brenda. I only know what the legally binding covenants say, I replied smoothly. And because the antique Chicago brick on my home is structurally incapable of surviving a high-pressure wash without catastrophic spalling and mortar failure, I was legally forced to comply with your alternate demand for a protective coating. I simply chose a strontium aluminate acrylic polymer because of its superior sealing properties and unmatched visibility. It's neon green, someone yelled from the back of the room. It's hideous, another voice chimed in. I held up a hand. Regardless of personal aesthetic preferences, I complied with the letter of the law as written in Section 14, subsection C. I opened the box and started sliding the heavy binders across the table. One to Brenda, one to the lawyer, one to each of the other board members. However, I continued, my voice hardening, dropping the casual tone entirely. I am not here to argue HOA bylaws, because HOA bylaws are completely irrelevant to this situation. The slick attorney frowned, opening his binder. Excuse me? The bylaws govern your property deed. The bylaws govern exterior maintenance, I corrected him. What is on the front of my house is not exterior maintenance. What is on the front of my house is a federally protected, original, site-specific work of visual art. It's conceptually titled Nuclear Dawn in Suburbia. Brenda let out a loud, mocking laugh. Art, you're calling that toxic waste spill art? You're insane. That doesn't change anything. We have the right to paint over it. Actually, Brenda, you don't, I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the table. I direct your counsel's attention to tab 3 in the binder. The contract signed between myself and the internationally exhibited contemporary artist known as Zephyr, commissioning this specific installation. The attorney flipped to tab 3. His eyes started scanning the page. And I direct your attention to tab 4, I continued, the volume of my voice rising slightly, taking command of the room. The United States Copyright Act, Title 17, Section 106A, better known as the Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1990, Vive A.R.A. The attorney's head snapped up. His eyes widened slightly. He knew exactly what VARA was. For those of you who aren't corporate lawyers, I said, turning slightly to address the crowd of residents behind me. The Visual Artists' Rights Act is a federal statute that protects the moral rights of artists. Specifically, it states that the author of a recognized work of visual art has the absolute right to prevent any intentional distortion, mutilation, or modification of that work. I turned back to Brenda. She was no longer smiling. She looked confused, staring at her attorney, waiting for him to shut me down. But he was frantically reading the contract I had provided. Furthermore, I said, locking eyes with Brenda, VARA prohibits the destruction of a work of recognized stature. Under federal law, such if a recognized artist creates a site-specific mural on a piece of property, and that mural is formally commissioned as an art piece, it cannot be altered, painted over, or destroyed by anyone. Not by me, not by the city, and certainly not by a petty neighborhood association. This is ridiculous, Brenda scoffed, though her voice wavered. It's a loophole. It's a gimmick. Our covenants restrict exterior paint colors. The covenants rule. Federal law supersedes neighborhood covenants, Brenda. That's basic civics, I said, my voice dripping with cynical satisfaction. I don't own the copyright to the exterior of my house anymore. Zephyr does. And under VARA, if you hire a contractor to show up at my house tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. with a bucket of desert sand paint, you will be committing a federal offense. I stood up, and I pointed a finger directly at the attorney. If one single drop of beige paint touches my strontium illuminate mural, the artist and I will file an immediate federal injunction in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida. We will not sue you in small claims. We will sue the Shady Pines Homeowners Association under the statutory damages clause of the Copyright Act. We will sue you for the maximum penalty of $150,000 per infringement, plus federal legal fees, which will easily exceed another $100,000. The entire room gasped. $250,000. That was more than the association's entire annual operating budget. "Counselor," I said, my voice deadly quiet. Am I misrepresenting the statute?" 80 homeowners turned their heads in unison to stare at the slick lawyer in the expensive suit. The lawyer was pale. He was sweating. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. He frantically flipped through the binder, looking at Zephyr's gallery exhibition records, confirming the recognized stature clause. He looked at the signed commissioning contract. He looked at the federal case law I had provided. He slowly closed the binder. He leaned over to Brenda. He didn't speak into the microphone. He covered it with his hand, but the room was so quiet, I could hear exactly what he whispered to her. "We can't touch it." Brenda physically recoiled as if he had slapped her. "What do you mean we can't touch it? It's green!" "Yet it violates the CC&Rs." "Brenda," the lawyer hissed, his professional composure completely breaking. "He didn't just paint his house. He created a federal intellectual property trap time. If we send a crew out there tomorrow, he's going to bankrupt this association. The legal fees alone to fight a VARA claim in federal court would drain our reserves in a month, and we would probably lose." "I don't care," Brenda shrieked, losing her mind in front of the entire neighborhood. She grabbed her gavel and slammed it on the table. "I will not have a glowing radioactive monstrosity in my neighborhood. We are painting it." Suddenly, a man stood up from the third row. It was Gary, the retired dentist from across the street. "Hold on a second, Brenda," Gary shouted. "You're telling me you're willing to risk a $250,000 lawsuit over this? We're the ones who pay the dues. If the HOA gets sued, our dues go up to cover the judgment. You're going to bankrupt us over a paint job?" "It's a matter of principle," Brenda yelled back. "It's a matter of you being a tyrant," another woman yelled from the back. "He tried to tell you he couldn't pressure wash the antique brick. You forced him into this. I'm not paying a special assessment to fund your ego trip." The room erupted. It was absolute chaos. Homeowners were standing up, yelling at the board, demanding that Brenda stand down. The lawyer was packing his briefcase, trying to subtly inch away from the table so he wouldn't be associated with the incoming riot. I just stood there, watching the empire crumble. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed, even better than the glowing house itself. And Brenda kept banging her gavel, but nobody was listening. Her power was gone. Her authority was broken by a technicality she couldn't comprehend, and a law she couldn't override. Finally, I held up my hands, signaling for quiet. Surprisingly, the room actually settled down to hear what I had to say. "I am a reasonable man," I announced, projecting my voice over the murmurs. "I don't actually want to live in a house that glows violently in the dark. I miss my antique Chicago brick. I miss the natural patina." I looked directly at Brenda, who was staring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "I am willing to contact the artist. I am willing to negotiate a waiver of his VARA rights, allowing me to carefully strip the clear coat and the luminous acrylic off the brick, and restoring the house to its original state. The room let out a collective sigh of relief. However, I continued, raising a single finger, I will only do this under one condition. I want a legally binding, permanent, written exemption added to my property deed. An exemption stating that the Shady Pines Homeowners Association, its board, and its architectural committee permanently surrender any and all jurisdiction over the masonry facade of my home. You will never issue me a citation for organic degradation again. You will never force me to clean it. You will never dictate its appearance. That brick belongs to history, and it belongs to me, not you. I slid a second piece of paper out of my jacket pocket, a drafted exemption form. I pushed it across the table toward the lawyer. If the board signs this exemption tonight, I said, the glow goes away. If you don't, I leave it up, and you can explain to the entire neighborhood why their dues are tripling to cover a federal copyright lawsuit. Your choice, Brenda. The lawyer didn't even read the exemption. He just grabbed a pen, signed his name as a witness, and shoved it aggressively toward Brenda. Sign it, the lawyer muttered. Sign it right now, or I am formally resigning as your counsel. Brenda looked at the paper. Her hands were shaking. She looked at the angry crowd of her neighbors, who were all glaring at her, waiting for her to submit. She had lost everything. Her pristine neighborhood, her absolute control, her dignity. She snatched the pen out of the lawyer's hand. She practically stabbed the paper with it, scribbling her signature at the bottom of the exemption. She threw the pen across the room, stood up, and stormed out the side door of the clubhouse without looking back. The room erupted into applause. Gary the dentist actually whistled. I picked up the signed exemption form, folded it neatly, and placed it in my breast pocket. I left the massive binders on the table for them to clean up. I walked out of the clubhouse and into the warm Florida night. I drove back to my cul-de-sac. My house was waiting for me. It was glowing brighter than ever, a massive silent monument to malicious compliance, casting its brilliant green light into the sky. It took me and Zephyr 3 weeks to carefully peel the industrial acrylic off the old Chicago brick. We had to use specialized, low-impact chemical strippers to avoid damaging the historical mortar. It cost me a few $1,000s out of pocket, but honestly, and it was worth every single penny. Brenda resigned from the board the following week, citing irreconcilable differences with the community. Gary the dentist was elected as the new HOA president. His first official act was to pass a motion officially commending my historic masonry as a unique architectural asset to the neighborhood. My house is back to normal now. The beautiful ashy pink patina of the 100-year-old brick is safe forever, shielded by a permanent legal exemption. But sometimes, on really hot, humid Florida nights, when the moon is hidden behind the clouds and the street lights are dim, I swear, I can still see a very, very faint trace of luminescent green lingering deep within the mortar joints. A tiny, glowing reminder to the entire neighborhood that if you push a homeowner far enough, they will always find a way to shine. Classic sovereign justice move. Have fun with this one. It's a ride.